The corpse of a German motorcycle scout was frozen solid to his leather saddle. The frost had shattered the cast-iron cylinder blocks of his heavy machine from the inside out, the metal splitting at the seams, unable to withstand the internal pressure of the ice. December 1941. The air had turned into a sharp suspension of crushed glass. The temperature had plummeted to an unnatural 42 degrees below zero. At this thermal threshold, standard weapon grease crystallizes instantly. Human blood thickens in minutes, stopping the heart. The German armada was methodically tightening its armored fist near Krasnaya Polyana. Only a few measly kilometers of straight line remained to the outskirts of the capital. The rhythm of the entire offensive was now dictated solely by absolute zero. The deadly cold was ruthlessly dismantling the logistics of both armies. High alloy steel grew brittle. The bolt of the bow machine gun seized solid in the savage freeze. In these unbearable conditions, HQ transmitted an urgent radiogram. The text was dry, devoid of emotion. The order left no room for maneuver. Stop the enemy's lead armored wedge at any cost on a narrow, icy forest road. Retreat was out of the question. There were no reinforcements in this isolated sector, and none were expected. Staff officers stared at the unfolded topographic map in mute, paralyzing shock. They understood the ruthless mathematics of this war all too well. A single medium tank thrown against a full-strength mechanized column. It was a guaranteed death sentence. The crew of the T-34 accepted the report in silence. All four were Siberians, hard men whose reflexes were forged in the white silence of the taiga. The tank commander, Sergeant Major Kuznetsov, folded the radiogram slip carefully, without haste. The skin on his weathered face was pulled tight by the frost. In his squinted eyes there was nothing but cold calculation, no youthful illusions. He knew the combat specs of every German machine inside and out. He knew the exact thickness of the rolled homogeneous armor on every enemy tank. He knew the weak spots and the turret traverse speed of every hostile vehicle. War on this frozen earth was devoid of lofty pathos. It was nothing but grueling, filthy, and bloody physical labor. Dying on this defensive line didn't automatically mean performing a heroic feat. Dying here meant letting the enemy's steel wedge push further east. The mission was crystal clear. Kill the crews and burn the steel until the ammo ran out or the gun's breech melted. Kuznetsov slammed his frozen canvas mitten against the icy armor of the turret. The sound was dull, like a heavy sledgehammer hitting a granite cliff. "Understood the mission, Commander," the driver mechanic croaked from his station. The extreme frost had long since seized his vocal cords. "Moving to the high ground. We're going to lock down that icy slope. The diesel cools fast in this wind. We won't last long in ambush. We'll stay as long as it takes for a clean shot. Start her up." With incredible physical effort, the driver stomped down the stiff, frozen clutch pedal. The powerful starter groaned under the strain, trying to turn the seized shafts. The diesel engine suddenly spat a thick column of black smoke onto the sparkling white snow. The tank's entire 30-ton hull shuddered violently. The transmission ground as it took on the colossal load. The war machine began to crawl slowly through deep, untouched drifts. Fine, hard snow dust instantly clogged every vision slit. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the temperature held steady at 30 below. The frozen metal aggressively sucked the last remnants of heat from their bodies. The crew remained dead silent. Idle talk only burned precious energy. Every jarring strike of the wide steel tracks against the frozen ground echoed as a vibration in their spines. The winding forest road narrowed sharply. Thick, centuries-old tree trunks stood like an impenetrable wall on both sides of the track. It was a perfect natural kill zone, and an absolute steel mass grave if a superior enemy managed to flank their position. Kuznetsov methodically assessed the terrain through his optics. The narrow forest corridor ensured the advancing Germans couldn't deploy their formations into a wide line, but the very first shell fired would inevitably give away their camouflaged firing point. After that, a ruthless point-blank duel to the death would begin. The laws of physics were working against both sides. The merciless frost continuously squeezed the road wheels. The rubber tires crumbled into fine dust under the immense weight of 30 tons of metal. The Siberians were acutely aware of the true cost of every second spent idling in such extreme cold. Shutting down the powerful diesel engine meant certain death for the entire crew. The engine oil in the crankcase would quickly turn into thick, immobile sludge. Fluids would crystallize, bursting the lines. Kuznetsov gave a short, sharp hand signal to throttle down to an absolute minimum. The tank crawled at a snail's pace into a pre-prepared position at the edge of a steep drop-off. Far below, the icy ribbon of the narrow road twisted in a strange pattern. The long, steep slope had turned into a perfectly smooth mirror of ice. It was the perfect tactical vantage point, and simultaneously, a deadly trap with zero chance of retreat. If German forward recon managed to send a foot patrol ahead of the main column, the ambush would be immediately exposed and destroyed by artillery. The tank's radio hissed menacingly with waves of static. A heavy, ringing silence pressed against the tanker's aching eardrums. A murky, cold gray dawn light filtered weakly through the bare, black trunks of the frozen trees. Time perception was irreversibly distorted by adrenaline and cold. 1 minute of high-tension waiting stretched into an endless year. The loader's numb fingers froze to the icy brass casings of the heavy shells. With a sharp, ruthless jerk, he tore his own skin from the frozen metal without a single groan. The flash of physical pain sobered his clouded mind. Thick, dark blood was left to dry on the cold, shiny brass of the casings. Kuznetsov stared incessantly through the eyepieces of the commander's periscope. The glass lenses rapidly frosted over with thick white rime from his heavy, ragged breathing. He had to constantly wipe the glass with a coarse wool rag, rubbing his palms raw. A single, careless movement would betray their position with a bright sun glint. The approaching professional enemy never forgave such amateur mistakes. Suddenly, the hard, frozen ground began to tremble, faintly, but rhythmically. A slight, growing vibration was transmitted through the steel control levers directly into his hands. These weren't gusts of the icy north wind. This was the colossal combined mass of approaching metal. Divisional HQ had been dead on with the coordinates. The heavy armored wedge was moving confidently toward their position. The distant mechanical hum of powerful engines gradually merged into a single, soul-crushing roar. High-quality German Krupp steel ruthlessly crushed the frozen undergrowth. The Wehrmacht's vanguard was moving in with confidence. Hundreds of tons of hostile armor, clanking their tracks, rolled steadily along the deep, icy ruts. Kuznetsov, slowly, controlling every movement, lowered the protective visor of his padded tanker's helmet. His hard, unblinking gaze locked onto the enemy's lead vehicle as it rounded the bend. Nervous tension reached its absolute breaking point. "They're coming. Load the AP into the breech." "Ready." The massive breech of the tank gun slammed shut with a dry, sharp, metallic clank. Ahead lay only the growing clatter of foreign tracks and the rapidly approaching, inevitable catastrophe. Night darkness shrouded the bank of the nameless river. An icy wind sheared off the top layer of snow. The sapper platoon had finished their back-breaking work 2 hours ago. They had turned the gentle river slope into a solid sheet of glass. Tons of river water had been poured onto the frozen ground. Now, instead of a road, there was a monolithic ice shell. No soldier's luck here, only raw engineering calculation and hellish physical labor. This slope would become a mass grave for enemy armor. But first, they had to survive the night themselves. The temperature dropped below the critical mark of 40 below. The hull metal aggressively sucked out the last of the heat. The tank had turned into a massive steel icebox. You couldn't stay inside the machine. You'd freeze to death in 40 minutes. Sergeant Major Kuznetsov climbed down into a deep earthen revetment. The crew had started a concealed fire at the very bottom of a deep pit. Smoke drifted up into the icy branches of the fir trees. "Listen to my orders." Kuznetsov's voice was dry, cracked by the frost. "Sleep in strict shifts. The man on watch kicks the sleeper every 15 minutes. Close your eyes for half an hour, and you'll never open them again." "Understood, Commander," the loader rasped. He instinctively reached his frozen hands toward the dim flame. "Keep your face away from the fire," Kuznetsov snapped. "If your skin thaws, it'll crack to the bone in the wind. Warm only your palms and feet." The hardest frontline routine began. The logic of winter warfare forgave no weakness. Soviet steel demanded heat. The crew drained the water and thick motor oil from the diesel. Heavy, black drops fell reluctantly into iron buckets. The liquid thickened before their eyes, turning into viscous tar. A frozen V2 engine was impossible to start in the cold. It had to be heated constantly and methodically. All night, the Siberians hauled heavy buckets to the fire. Clouds of thick white steam mixed with acrid soot. The tankers' faces were covered in a thick layer of black oil. Acrid smoke stung their inflamed eyes. Every movement took incredible effort. Frozen, oil-soaked fatigues were stiff as boards. The fabric cracked at the joints, cutting skin and making it hard to breathe. They gathered glowing red-hot coals into a wide steel brazier. The driver-mechanic crawled to drag it directly under the tank's armored belly. The red glow of the coals barely pierced the pitch darkness. It was a desperate, deadly risk. One accidental glint of flame would instantly attract a German night patrol. One stray German mortar round would end their mission before the fight even started. But without a warmed crankcase, the tank would remain a dead heap of metal. Heat from the brazier rose slowly toward the engine compartment. The risk was fully justified by absolute necessity. The diesel had to start on the first turn of the starter. Otherwise, the ice trap wouldn't snap shut. The night stretched on forever. Every minute sapped the last remnants of their strength. The frost crept under their padded jackets, paralyzing muscles and slowing blood flow. The loader on watch slammed his hand against the driver's shoulder. He jerked awake, struggling to open bleary eyes. Sleep in such extreme cold was like a sweet narcotic coma. The body begged to give up, to close its eyes and sleep forever. Kuznetsov methodically checked his sidearm. The bolt of his submachine gun was completely stripped of factory grease and rubbed with dry graphite. Only then would the precision mechanics not fail at the decisive second. Any liquid lubricant now meant a guaranteed weapon failure. Cause dictated action. Action determined survival. The sudden, sharp crack of a breaking branch made everyone freeze instantly. Weapons were leveled toward the sound. The darkness of the winter forest hid a deadly unknown. Heartbeats drowned out the whistle of the icy wind.
Fingers rested on cold steel triggers.
A dead silence pressed against their temples. Kuznetsov peered into the gloom, then gave a short signal to lower the barrels. Just the wood's reaction to the cold. The fierce frost was splitting thick tree trunks from the inside. The tension eased slightly, but adrenaline continued to boil in their thickened blood. This night was exhausting the crew worse than a head-on engagement. They were spending their life force solely on maintaining the temperature of their own bodies and the machine. Another bucket of heavy oil was placed on the edge of the smoldering fire. The loader accidentally caught the handle with his boot. The bucket tilted. Black sludge threatened to douse the last coals. The driver-mechanic grabbed the red-hot metal handle with his bare hands, steadying the container. Skin hissed, sticking to the iron. Not a single sound. The pain was muffled by the cold and extreme concentration. "Keep it steady," Kuznetsov hissed through gritted teeth. "I've got it," the driver replied quietly, tucking his burned palm into his sleeve. The bucket's metal quickly blackened from the acrid soot. The liquid inside slowly began to boil. The distinct smell of burning and hot machine oil filled the deep revetment. This was grueling, filthy, back-breaking labor. There was no pretty heroism in these frost-bitten, blackened faces. Only the automatic movements of seasoned professionals. Living men had turned into organic appendages of the steel machine. Their only task was to ensure its combat readiness at any cost. They fed the tank continuously with their warmth, their sleep, and their lives. The wind intensified sharply, throwing handfuls of stinging snow pellets into their faces. Through the howling blizzard came a distant, barely audible, rhythmic hum. This wasn't the frost cracking of trees. This was heavy German armor operating a few kilometers to the west. The enemy wasn't sleeping. The enemy was methodically prepping their machines for the morning dash to the capital. Kuznetsov looked closely at his commander's watch. The crystal was covered in a thick frost pattern, exactly 3 hours until the dim dawn. 3 hours of continuous struggle for every degree of heat. 3 hours of balancing on the thin edge of frostbite and accidental discovery. The buckets of used oil were put back on the fire. The process repeated with killing regularity. The engineering of survival tolerated no failures. The slightest mistake meant certain death for the crew and the failure of the strategic mission. A gray dawn cut through the thick frost haze. The air rang with the extreme cold. A heavy mechanical roar tore through the silence of the frozen forest. The Wehrmacht's forward patrol crawled onto the winding road. The steel wedge pulled confidently into the narrow throat of the forest corridor. Medium panzers led the way. Behind them trailed half-tracks and heavy trucks carrying motorized infantry. The German drivers had implicit trust in the operation of their gasoline engines. The lead command vehicle began the steep climb up the high riverbank. 30 tons of German steel confidently crawled onto the smooth mirror of the slope. The narrow tracks hit the monolithic ice. Traction vanished instantly. The smooth metal of the tracks spun frantically against the frozen crust. Winter cleats were missing. The factory European standard was designed for hard ground or light snow. Steel screeched helplessly against the ice shell. The gasoline engine wailed in agony. RPMs climbed to the absolute red line. The tank stalled right in the middle of the climb. Torque failed completely. The multi-ton behemoth broke loose and slid backward. Heavy metal slid inexorably down the icy chute. The hull slewed sideways across the packed ruts. The massive bulk slammed into the following vehicle with full force. The crash of crumpling frontal armor drowned out the roar of the engines.
The rear tank flew off the icy embankment into a deep ditch.
Metal crunched as it crushed its own infantry, who hadn't managed to jump clear. The column ground to a dead halt. The route was completely blocked by twisted metal. German officers screamed orders frantically. Infantrymen leaped in droves from the truck beds into the deep snow. Short leather boots sank knee-deep. The icy north wind instantly pierced their thin wool greatcoats. Drivers desperately tried to reverse. The rear ranks, unable to see the obstacle, kept pushing forward. The vehicles crushed themselves into the narrow bottleneck. A dead, impassable gridlock formed. Engines stalled one after another from extreme overloads. German summer-grade oil crystallized in the stopped engines within minutes. Lubricant turned into solid glue. Powerful starters burned out in blue smoke trying to turn frozen crankshafts. The mechanics were dead. The ice trap had snapped shut without a single shot fired. Kuznetsov didn't take his inflamed eyes off the panoramic sight. His breathing was measured. His pulse was steady. "They're dead in the water." "I see them," the gunner replied dryly, glued to the eyepiece. "Leads turned sideways. Right flank is wide open. Range 400 meters. Wait for the column to be completely blocked." The frost continued to methodically kill the paralyzed enemy. German tankers tried to traverse their turrets manually. The grease in the turret rings was frozen solid. Traverse mechanisms jammed. Gears, brittle from the cold, snapped under desperate jerks of the manual drives. The steel boxes turned into stationary, blind targets. Gun barrels pointed in every direction. Fire maneuver was absolutely impossible. The track was packed tight with mangled metal. Heavy trucks slid helplessly into deep ditches. Half-track tractors tried to pull out stuck anti-tank guns. Rubber road wheel tires spun uselessly on the bare ice. The sharp snap of breaking steel tow cables could be heard. Gun barrels buried themselves deep in the snowdrifts. Fine Zeiss optics were instantly clogged with stinging snow. The situation below turned into methodical, uncontrolled chaos. The trap had worked with flawless precision. The engineering calculation of the Soviet sappers had completely destroyed the mobility of an entire tank company. Physics had defeated Krupp's steel. The German steel wedge had broken itself against the icy slope. The enemy was securely trapped in an open, exposed kill zone. There was no escape. The flanks were closed by impenetrable thick forest and 6-foot snow. Their own rear was pressing in from behind. In front, an insurmountable wall of smooth ice. The 40 below temperature quickly finished off those trying to operate outside the armor. Severe frostbite set in within minutes. Soldiers' bare hands froze solid to the icy metal of their rifles. Skin tore away in bloody strips. "They're panicking," the loader whispered, ramming a heavy shell into the breach. "Target number 1, the lead tank," Kuznetsov barked. "Target number 2, the rear APC." "Copy. Range 350 meters. No HE on the infantry. AP only. We're burning the iron boxes." Tension inside the cramped fighting compartment mounted rapidly. The acrid smell of cold sweat cut through the usual stench of gun oil. The men had finally merged with the cold metal. The crosshairs of the sight settled exactly under the turret ring of the lead German tank. The enemy commander opened his top hatch in a panic. He tried to visually assess the scale of the unfolding catastrophe. Through his binoculars, he saw only a solid, insurmountable sheet of ice. He didn't see the camouflaged long barrel on the high ground. The Siberians coolly noted the moment. No gloating, no hatred. Only the cold, precise calculation of a professional bringing down a heavy hammer. It was just a dirty job. The enemy had made a critical, fatal mistake. The enemy had to be methodically destroyed. The German column twitched convulsively in its death throes. One of the medium tanks miraculously started its frozen engine. Thick blue flames roared from the exhaust pipes. Wide tracks tore at the ice with a piercing shriek. The tank desperately tried to break out of the trap. The hull lurched violently to the side. The behemoth rammed into the side of a nearby army truck. The wooden body shattered into splinters. Soldiers fell screaming under the steel road wheels. The dull crunch of breaking bones was drowned out by the engine's strained roar. The tank jerked and stalled again. Another snapped transmission shaft. A piercing metallic screech echoed through the frozen winter forest. The column had finally turned into a massive, static target. A perfect, ruthless shooting gallery. The line of fire was completely clear. The wind blew fine snow dust off the ice mirror, exposing the black marks of useless sliding. Kuznetsov gripped the black Bakelite intercom button painfully hard. Cold sweat ran slowly down his dirty face. His eyes were locked onto the periscope eyepiece. His finger rested on the trigger. "The trap is closed. Breech is locked and loaded," the gunner stated flatly. "Driver, end the warm-up. Prepare for a rapid dash." "Copy, Commander." "Hit them right under the turret. Fire when ready." Time compressed into the space of a single short command. The driver-mechanic yanked the thick frosted canvas off the metal buckets. The thick machine oil inside was heated to the limit. Scalding hot water gave off thick white steam. In such extreme cold, this steam was an immediate death sentence. The whitish cloud over the cover would inevitably give away their hidden position. Enemy observers were tensely scanning the forest edge through Zeiss optics. There was no choice. The risk of detection was outweighed by the acute strategic necessity of delivering a sudden dagger thrust to the flank. "Pour it," Sergeant Major Kuznetsov ordered gruffly. The radio operator and the driver tipped the heavy buckets in unison.
Hot water hissed aggressively as it entered the frozen cooling system.
Scalding, thick oil poured quickly into the wide mouth of the crankcase. The diesel received its critically needed dose of heat. The temperature inside the engine compartment shot up, melting the ice on the metal lines. The enemy below continued to spin their tracks frantically on the smooth, icy slope. Their gasoline engines choked and stalled from the colossal overloads. "Contact! Start it up!" The driver mashed the stiff, frozen pedal with incredible effort. The powerful starter wailed as it turned the heavy, frost-bound flywheel. A second of dead silence. Metal screeched under the wild strain. The frozen steel reluctantly gave way. The powerful V2 diesel engine coughed deafeningly with thick, black smoke. Massive pistons compressed the enriched fuel mixture. The engine roared to life. A dull, low, steady growl filled the deep, earthen revetment. A slight vibration was instantly transmitted to the cold, armored hull. The tank shuddered heavily, ready to strike. The steel had awakened. "First gear, full throttle, let's go," Kuznetsov stated flatly. Wide steel tracks bit into the frozen ground with a clatter. 30 tons of Soviet metal lurched out of the camouflaged ambush. The hard snow crust snapped with a dry crackle under the weight of the road wheels. The camo net tore to shreds, snagging on the sharp fir branches. The tank surged onto the open firing line. The line of fire was completely clear of obstacles. The enemy armored column lay helplessly sprawled below on the mirror of the icy slope. German crews turned their heads in panic at the sudden, beast-like roar of the Soviet diesel. They saw only the rapidly approaching, dark green, angular silhouette. The Soviet machine quickly gained speed. The oncoming icy wind whistled through the narrow vision slits. "Range 400 meters. Load AP." "Ready!" the loader shouted, slamming home the heavy fixed round.
The heavy breech block slams shut with a metallic clang, locking the chamber tight. "Lead target. Fire!" The firing pedal is stomped into the iron floor. A dull, bone-jarring thud shakes the cramped turret. The massive recoil of the gun hurls the heavy breech backward with violent force. The extraction mechanism spits out the casing. The hot brass hits the floor with a sharp ring, landing among a sea of spent machine gun shells. Thick, acrid carbon monoxide instantly fills the narrow fighting compartment. Oxygen burns away rapidly. Breathing becomes physically painful. A steel slug tears through the freezing air. The heavy shell, carrying monstrous kinetic energy, slams dead center into the vulnerable flank of the lead German tank. High-quality Krupp steel bursts at the seams. The armor fails against the point-blank, perpendicular hit. An internal detonation of the ammo rack rips the enemy machine to pieces. The heavy, angular turret is blown clean off its ring with a roar, crushing a nearby armored personnel carrier. A brilliant firestorm erupts over the icy slope, casting an ominous glow on the grey dawn. "Target destroyed. Load HE. Up!" The loader works with absolute mechanical precision. No wasted motion. His hands, stained with deep-seated black grease and dried blood from burst calluses, instinctively grab the heavy new cylinders. A swing, a short shove. The breech snaps shut. "Infantry by the soft-skin trucks. Fire!" The second shot merges with the deafening echo of the first. The high-explosive blast turns the wooden truck beds and the frozen enemy personnel into a bloody pulp. The column is completely paralyzed by panic and ice. The Germans desperately try to fight back. Surviving crews frantically crank frozen turret handwheels. The rapid cracks of tank guns return fire. An enemy armor-piercing round skips off the Soviet machine's sloped glacis plate with a sickening shriek. A bright spray of blinding sparks showers the optics. The armor holds firm against the glancing blow. The calculated slope saves the Siberians' lives. The ricochet sends the slug screaming into the empty sky. The tank doesn't slow its pace. The reliable diesel engine roars steadily at max RPMs. The machine relentlessly closes the distance, looming like a heavy steel shadow over the paralyzed ice trap. "Driver, don't stop. Fire on the move." "Copy that, Commander." Carbon monoxide pools thick under the low turret ceiling. Eyes sting and water from the acrid smoke. The exhaust fan whines under the strain, failing to clear the dense cloud of propellant residue. A dry cough tears at their throats, but no one pays it the slightest mind. The rhythm of battle has them fully in its grip. The cause is an order. The action is a shot. The effect is a burning enemy tank. This simple, brutal formula repeats again and again. The metal floor of the fighting compartment is carpeted in slippery, spent casings. The loader stumbles, falling hard on his knees onto the jagged brass. But he's up in an instant, clutching another shell tight. Physical pain is ignored. The instinct for self-preservation is entirely suppressed by the mission at hand. The tank continues its relentless forward drive, transformed into a perfect killing machine. The living men inside are merely reliable components of a single death delivery system. The counterstrike unfolds according to the laws of cold physics and merciless frontline tactics. German gunners, gripped by blind panic, stomp desperately on their electric firing pedals. They are met only with a dead, ringing silence.
The batteries have been drained flat by the brutal overnight frost. The enemy crews frantically switch to manual traverses to turn their heavy turrets. Frozen hands in thin wool gloves tear skin away as they try to crank the stiff steel hand wheels. Thick, frozen grease has seized the massive gear rings of the turret races. The metal of the transfer gears, made brittle by the extreme cold, cannot withstand the raw physical force. There is a dry, sharp snap of breaking steel teeth. The turrets of the enemy strike machines freeze in unnatural, skewed positions. Long gun barrels stare helplessly into the empty, snow-covered pine forest. Cutting-edge European engineering finally capitulates to the breath of absolute zero. The pride of the German panzer divisions is turned into blind, utterly immobile steel sarcophagi. One desperate anti-tank gun crew miraculously manages to deploy their heavy trails on the bare ice. A sharp yellow muzzle flash cuts through the gray frost haze. A heavy German armor-piercing slug hits the nose of the rapidly advancing Soviet machine with a wild, piercing scream. The sloped armor takes the direct hit with cold indifference. The laws of ballistics work flawlessly. The lethal shell's kinetic energy is deflected along a tangential trajectory. The compressed metal strikes a spray of blinding, white-hot sparks. The enemy round howls away, high into the leaden sky. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the Siberians feel only a dull, blunt thud against the hull. No one even flinches. The unfailing V2 diesel engine continues to rhythmically and greedily devour the freezing air. The powerful roar of the heavy motor drowns out the ringing in their shell-shocked ears. The driver mechanic keeps a hard grip on the levers. 30 tons of steel confidently crush the frozen earth, lining up the perfect angle for the next killing blow. AP loaded. The loader's voice crackles dryly through the throat mic. Target right of the marker. Command tank. Flanks open. Target in sight. Fire! The heavy pedal hits the metal floor. The deafening blast of the gun shatters eardrums. The turret instantly fills with acrid, suffocating carbon monoxide. A lethal chunk of Soviet steel punches through the thin side armor of the German tank. An internal explosion of the full combat load rips the heavy angular turret off its ring. The mangled piece of black metal falls heavily with a crunch onto the icy slope. Target destroyed, the gunner reports in a monotone. There isn't a single gram of triumph or joy in his voice, only the hollow confirmation of hard work completed. Load HE, Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov replies, just as flatly, devoid of emotion. Same marker, infantry cluster by the knocked-out APC. Up! Fire! The surviving German tankers quickly realize the absolute hopelessness of the situation. Cold metal no longer protects lives. Thick armor has become a magnet for inevitable death. Turret hatches are flung back in a frenzy. Panicking men scramble out of the smoke-filled bellies of the burning machines. They are wearing only thin wool side caps and light mouse-gray autumn greatcoats. The European summer uniforms offer zero protection against 40 below temperatures. The freezing northern wind instantly slices through their thin bodies like a razor, down to the very bone. Their lungs seize in a painful spasm at the first deep gulp of freezing air. The enemy soldiers sink deep into high snowdrifts. Their short leather boots immediately fill with stinging, hard snow. Irreversible frostbite sets in within minutes. They try desperately to run toward the safety of the woods, but frozen muscles quickly refuse to obey the brain's commands. Hull MG, sweep the retreating infantry. On it! The machine gun spits out a long, merciless burst of lead. Heavy bullets thud into frozen human bodies, with a dull, wet sound. German soldiers drop like sacks into the blinding white snow, leaving dark, rapidly freezing bloodstains. No one screams in pain. The savage frost paralyzes weak vocal cords much faster than animal terror. Death in the snowdrifts comes almost silently. The execution of the paralyzed column turns into a methodical, routine factory shift at a conveyor belt.
Inside the scorching turret, the Siberians work like a single, perfectly synchronized clockwork mechanism. Each crew member performs his sole, strictly defined function. The loader slams a heavy brass shell into the open breech. The massive breech block clangs, locking death inside the barrel. The gunner coolly catches the next target in the crosshairs of his optic. Fire. The hard recoil of the barrel, the sharp ejection of the smoking spent casing onto the iron-cluttered floor. The air inside the cramped turret heats up significantly from the glowing gun barrel. The faces of the Soviet tankers, blackened by deep-seated soot, shine thick with sticky, cold sweat. Breathing becomes harder with every new salvo. The exhaust fan is completely overwhelmed by the dense, toxic cloud of powder fumes. The loader mechanically wipes his blood-raw palms on his filthy, padded jacket. Physical pain has long since retreated to the very back of his consciousness. All that remains is muscle memory and the instinct to destroy. The enemy armored column is ablaze. Thick, oily black smoke hugs the icy river slope. Greedy flames quickly devour the mangled remains of the army trucks. Frozen fuel in punctured tanks finally finds a long-awaited spark. The sharp, dull pops of exploding gas tanks merge into one continuous, soul-crushing drone. "Range, 150 meters," the gunner reports hoarsely. "AP, self-propelled gun on the right flank. Target in the sights. Fire!" Another crushing blow shakes the hull. The armor-piercing shell punches clean through the thin casemate of the assault gun. The enemy cannon slumps, its long barrel dipping into the frozen, hard earth. The German steel wedge has finally ceased to exist as an organized fighting unit. The machinery is smashed to bits. The crews are wiped out. The remnants of the personnel are freezing to death in deep roadside drifts. The unfailing Soviet diesel continues its steady, menacing growl. Its heavy rhythm is the rhythm of relentless, brutal, frontline justice. The iron is working perfectly. The Siberians continue their grim, everyday business. No pity for the enemy. No wasted doubts. Only icy mathematical calculation and the precise execution of a direct order for total annihilation. The roar of the 76mm tank gun cuts off abruptly. A heavy, unnatural silence follows, immediately broken by the steady, menacing snarl of the V2 diesel engine. The icy slope in front of the camouflaged position is completely littered with mangled, smoking metal. Thick, oily black smoke rises in heavy, leaden plumes toward the pale winter sky. The blinding white morning snow is now thick with a layer of greasy soot, soaked in gasoline and scorched by white-hot steel fragments. The wedge is shattered. The offensive momentum of the Wehrmacht's lead mechanized detachment has been dropped to absolute zero. The steel boxes of the German strike machines burn fiercely on the open range. Through the howling northern wind, the dull, rhythmic crack of factory welds bursting from the colossal heat can be clearly heard. These are no longer fearsome European armored vehicles capable of taking capitals. They are dead iron husks, frozen forever into the Russian soil. Inside the cramped tank turret, there is absolutely nothing to breathe. The enclosed volume of air is critically poisoned by a dense, toxic suspension of carbon monoxide
and burnt, smokeless powder. The Soviet tankers' faces are covered in a thick black crust of acrid sweat, machine oil, and embedded soot. With a long, raspy groan, the loader straightens his stiff, aching back. The ribbed metal floor of the fighting compartment is ankle-deep in empty, spent brass casings. The metal still aggressively holds the searing heat of the shots fired, warming the air from below. "Clear the deck! Dump the brass!" Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov commands dryly, without a hint of emotion. With a massive physical effort, the loader kicks open the heavy lower escape hatch. The lethally cold frost air rushes into the scorching turret with a strained howl. The temperature inside drops instantly. The icy draft mercilessly cuts into inflamed lungs, instantly chilling the sweat-soaked padded uniforms. One by one, the heavy brass cylinders fly out with a dull thud, landing directly on the blackened, blood-stained snow. The sharp ring of metal mixes with the monotone roar of the raging fires outside. The crew methodically, without haste, clears their living space. This is the grim, exhausting routine of the front. Heavy, dirty work requires an absolutely clean workspace for the next inevitable cycle of destruction. The diesel runs steadily at idle, greedily sucking in the freezing air. Kuznetsov doesn't take his inflamed eyes off the commander's panoramic sight for a second, carefully scanning the smoke-filled woods. Stopping doesn't mean safety. "Driver, full systems report. Engine hours. Oil pressure normal. Coolant temp at 90 degrees. The driver mechanic calls back through the constant crackle of the throat mic. "Transmission's holding for now. Left clutch is running hot. Fuel is exactly half a tank. Gunner, status of the main gun. Barrel is critically overheated. Recuperator fluid is boiling. The breech is sticking from thermal expansion. We cannot fire again, or the breech will blow." Kuznetsov silently accepts these dry, merciless numbers. The mathematics of tank combat are unforgiving. The Soviet high-alloy steel survived the extreme dynamic load, but fundamental physics demands a mandatory pause to cool the overheated mechanisms. "Counting confirmed kills." The commander's voice remains perfectly flat, as if he were reading a warehouse inventory. 12 medium tanks, 8 half-tracks, 4 soft-skin trucks. The enemy vanguard has completely lost mobility and combat effectiveness. A payload is 60% depleted. 12 HE rounds left, the loader adds monotonically, slamming the lower hatch shut with a clang. The frost immediately retreats before the heat of the glowing breech. They cannot fully relax. A loss of concentration at this stage is equivalent to an immediate execution. The thick black smoke of the burning German armor against the blinding white background perfectly masks enemy movement. The tank's optics are caked in greasy soot and ash. The tension inside the hull doesn't drop for a second. Suddenly, a strong gust of northern wind rips the dense veil of smoke away from the right flank of the shattered column. On the dark edge of the frozen forest, a foreign, geometric silhouette appears. It's not a knocked-out truck or a tank hull. It's the low, squat steel gun shield of a carefully camouflaged 50mm anti-tank gun. A surviving German crew, having miraculously lived through the steel meat grinder on the ice, is silently manhandling the heavy split trails into position. The enemy artillerymen methodically bring the stationary, cooling Soviet machine into their crosshairs. The T-34's gun is absolutely useless. The barrel is too hot. The hydraulic recuperator fluid isn't ready for another shot. Any press of the firing pedal will result in an internal explosion. "Driver, threat right! A T-gun! Crew on position! Reverse! Get us behind the ridge! Kuznetsov's voice hits like a short blade strike. Command received. Levers back. Hang on! The massive tank lurches backward with a sharp, strained jolt. The wide steel tracks furiously churn the frozen earth, struggling to find purchase on the icy ground. The German anti-tank gun silently spits a long plume of bright yellow flame. A sharp sub-caliber slug tears through the freezing air with a wild, brain-drilling whistle, passing millimeters from the turret armor. The monstrous shockwave blasts the snow clean off the nearby branches. The situation on the battlefield spirals out of control in an instant. The hunter and the cornered prey have suddenly swapped places. The tank is practically blind, the main gun is temporarily out of commission, and a professional enemy has them dead in their sights. The Soviet crew's survival once again depends solely on the thickness of the sloped steel armor, the torque of the diesel, and the lightning-fast reaction of the driver. The risk of a fatal penetration increases with every fraction of a second. The heavy Soviet machine crushes the frozen evergreen brush with a deafening snap. Sharp, icy branches scrape against the sloped glacis with a screech. The tracks crunch into the hard snowpack. Saving cover is found. The enemy anti-tank gun instantly loses its maneuvering target. The driver-mechanic jerks the right control lever back with his full weight. The steel side clutch howls under the colossal overload. The tank spins rapidly on the spot, kicking up dense fountains of stinging snow dust. 30 tons of accelerated steel lunge forward in a predatory strike. The powerful shockwave shears the snowcaps off the nearest trees. The wide tracks bite into the Germans' fresh position with a horrific metallic clang. The metal of the split trails, brittle from the extreme cold, snaps with a dry crack under the weight of the road wheels. The crew doesn't even have time to scream. The crunch of mangled iron and breaking human bones merges completely with the monotone howl of the winter blizzard. The lethal threat is neutralized. The tank freezes again at the dark edge of the protective forest. The reliable diesel drops from high RPMs to a steady, menacing growl. Through the narrow vision slits, the Siberians watch the finale of the unfolding slaughter. There is no soldierly exultation. Human joy has been completely burned out by acrid carbon monoxide and an extreme surge of adrenaline. All that remains inside is the leaden, crushing weight of the bloody work they've done. The smooth, icy slope has finally turned into a giant mass grave for the Wehrmacht's lead mechanized detachment. Surviving occupiers flee in blind panic away from the burning machines. They abandon their critically wounded comrades in droves. They throw away their personal weapons. They forever abandon their foreign pride. The thin European mouse-gray greatcoats offer no protection. The soldiers jump frantically into deep roadside drifts. The loose snow swallows them up to their chests, pinning their movements. The frost strikes hard. 42 degrees below zero works far more effectively than machine gun belts. The blood in the veins of the fleeing men thickens in minutes. Weak hearts fail to pump the icy, viscous fluid. The Germans drop, one by one, right into the snowdrifts. They try desperately to crawl. Frost-bitten white fingers claw at the hard snow crust until they bleed. Sharp ice crystals mercilessly tear thin capillaries. Rapid, irreversible necrosis of living tissue begins. Gangrene devours human limbs on the move. Right before their eyes, living soldiers turn into immobile ice statues, locked in eternal cold. The enemy army pays a horrific, irreplaceable physical price for every wrong step on this frozen land. This is the absolute, harsh justice of the North. Merciless nature methodically and coolly purges its sector of uninvited strangers. A thick, sour powder fog hangs in the frozen tank turret. The exhaust fan whines strainingly under the ceiling, but fails completely against the dense, toxic smog. The stale, poisoned air physically cuts into inflamed lungs. Every new breath is a struggle for the crew. The ragged, labored breathing of 4 men echoes loudly in their headsets. The men are slowly suffocating, but the turret hatches absolutely cannot be opened. The extreme external temperature would kill the crew much faster than the carbon monoxide. The Soviet tankers' faces are coated in a thick crust of black soot, machine oil, and frozen sweat. Their eyes are inflamed to the absolute limit. The tiny capillaries in their eyeballs have burst from the sheer strain and acrid smoke. The gunner leans his damp forehead heavily against the cold metal of the massive breech. The steel noticeably burns his skin even through the thick fabric of his winter helmet. The loader, mechanically, on pure reflex, recounts the heavy shells remaining in the racks. His numbed fingers slide clumsily over the icy brass of the casings. The dead silence inside the halted machine presses against their eardrums far harder than the deafening roar of the recent close-quarters fight. This is the pure psychology of heavy, extremely dirty frontline labor. The Russian land must be cleared of armed trash. The trash is actively resisting. Therefore, the trash must be methodically destroyed. There are no high philosophical matters here, only the dry, brutal statistics of dead enemies and surviving comrades. "That's it," the gunner whispers into the intercom, his voice incredibly raspy. His throat is completely shot from the dry coughing. "Movement in the kill zone has stopped." "I see it," Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov replies just as quietly, using barely more than his cracked lips. "The infantry froze to death. The armor is completely burnt out. The column is dead." "We stopped them here." "We only just started our work. That was only the vanguard. There's an entire panzer division on a forced march behind them." This short dialogue sounds as dry as possible. There isn't the slightest shadow of victorious pathos in their voices. The tankers are simply stating an indisputable physical fact. The enemy is dead. The mission at this specific line has been successfully completed. But they cannot relax their muscles for a single second. Suddenly, from the right, behind the smoking wreck of a shattered APC, a dark, hunched figure slowly emerges. A surviving German officer. His gray greatcoat is horribly scorched. His face is a solid black, bleeding mask. In his stiff, unbending right hand, a heavy anti-tank grenade is clutched tight. He isn't running for cover. He is trudging, swaying violently from weakness, straight toward the camouflaged Soviet tank. The human instinct for self-preservation has been completely overridden by deep, pain-induced shock. He wants only one thing: to get close enough to throw his last charge directly under the steel tracks. The distance closes rapidly. 50 meters, 40 meters, 30 meters. "Commander, single infantry target on the right flank, grenade in hand." "Target in sight, observing." Kuznetsov deliberately avoids the coaxial machine gun's trigger. He simply watches the enemy coldly through the thick glass of the optics. Absolute frost is doing the work of bullets now. At a distance of exactly 20 meters, the German stumbles hard over the frozen corpse of one of his own. The officer collapses onto his knees in the deep snow. He frantically tries to yank the metal pin from the long wooden handle of a stick grenade. Frost-bitten fingers, turned completely to wood, refuse to obey the brain's commands. Tendons have snapped from critical hypothermia. The German helplessly drops the munition. He slowly lifts a mangled face toward the pale winter sky. His mouth opens soundlessly in a mute scream. The emaciated body slumps heavily onto its left side. Death is almost instantaneous. Extreme cold stops the weak heartbeat forever. An icy shroud claims another dead invader. Threat neutralized by the laws of nature, the tank commander reports, his voice perfectly flat. Copy that, the driver responds immediately. Diesels holding steady RPMs, component temps within operating range. They remain motionless in their forest ambush. The exhausted tankers' bodies are racked by periodic, uncontrollable tremors. This isn't animal fear. It's the natural physiological reaction of the human organism to extreme nervous exhaustion and the lethal cold slowly but surely seeping through the thick steel armor. The Siberians have done their grim soldiers' work. They cold-bloodedly turned a formidable German mechanized wedge into a pile of smoking, useless scrap metal. But ruthless war never grants time for rest. War demands constant, continuous forward movement. The tankers stare silently through the vision blocks at the smoldering pyres of German strategic ambitions. Acrid black smoke gradually dissipates under the powerful gusts of a strengthening north wind. Open flames quickly devour the last remnants of automotive paint and canvas. Soon the wrecked metal will cool completely. Soon the ice-slicked slope mangled by tank treads will be covered by a new, pristine layer of white snow. Winter will forever hide the traces of this brutal, methodical slaughter. But while the iron still smokes, the tankers are duty-bound to keep their assigned sector in their sights. Every extra minute of motionless waiting ruthlessly drains the last scraps of life force. Every long second of ringing silence echoes in their headsets like the heavy tolling of a bell. They know with absolute clarity that more enemy columns, more ambushes, and more dirty work clearing the land lie ahead. The hollow echo of duty fulfilled resonates continuously through the frozen metal of the Soviet hull. The dead silence of the frozen turret is suddenly shattered by a sharp, electrical crackle. The 10RT tank radio struggles to life. The airwaves are thick with heavy atmospheric interference and the monotonous rumble of distant artillery fire. The icy metal of the headset cups presses painfully against frost-bitten ears. The radio operator gunner frantically turns the stiff ebonite frequency dial. Frozen copper contacts spark weakly in the gloom. Through the dense, continuous veil of white noise, the call sign of the tank brigade, HQ, breaks through, distorted by distance and the extreme cold. Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov slowly brings the black carbolite microphone to his cracked lips. The skin on his face is pulled tight by dried mud, gun grease, and frozen sweat. No victory reports follow. No survivor's joy. Only the dry, exhaustive statement of physical fact. Earth, this is Falcon. Lead wedge broken. Axis of advance completely blocked by wreckage. Enemy movement halted entirely. Falcon, this is Earth. Copy that. Confirming reception. Await further instructions. Out. The voice of the duty radio officer on the other end of the invisible thread trembles slightly with tension. At that very moment, staff officers silently erase a thick red arrow from a spread-out topographic map. That line drawn on paper had been thrusting threateningly toward the northern outskirts of the capital. Now that line no longer exists in reality. The deadly threat of a breakthrough has been liquidated solely by the skill of 4 exhausted men and 30 tons of Soviet alloy steel. The strategic turning point on this narrow, corpse-strewn sector of the front has been reached. The local breakthrough is finally prevented. But here on the front line, this only means a brief technical pause before the next merciless meat grinder. The radio operator releases the stiff metal transmit toggle. Numb fingers slip clumsily off the frozen iron. An accidental frequency shift of a few notches abruptly changes the soundscape. A foreign, unfamiliar radio wave suddenly flares up in the crew's headsets. The German airwaves are literally drowning in hysterical, high-pitched screams. No legendary composure, no vaunted iron discipline, only primal, uncontrollable animal panic. Surviving Wehrmacht officers desperately request urgent medical evacuation. They scream into microphones about full-strength companies freezing to death, about cylinder blocks cracking en masse, about the total paralysis of all offensive formations. Through this ethereal chaos, the harsh, emotionless, metallic voice of High Command in Berlin cuts through. The radio wave brings a categorical order, absolutely insane given the weather conditions. Not a step back. Hold the current lines at any cost. Execution for abandoning positions. Kuznetsov listens coldly to the foreign speech. His eyes remain completely vacant. The German army is melting away before his eyes, turning into frozen chunks of meat in summer uniforms. Cruel orders from warm, comfortable European offices are utterly powerless against the immutable laws of physics and the breath of absolute zero. Ice doesn't know how to listen to generals' orders. Ice only knows how to methodically kill those who aren't ready for it. High-ranking officers demand an immediate offensive, while their frost-bitten soldiers can't even cycle the bolts on their rifles. The enemy's command machine has suffered a critical, irreparable failure. The accidental radio intercept exposes the hidden, dirty truth of this winter war. Vaunted German logistics and organization have shattered into tiny pieces against the Siberian frost and Soviet stubbornness. "Hear them howling?" the loader whispers, barely audibly into his throat mic. Thick carbon monoxide makes it hard to speak at full volume. "They're already corpses," the tank commander cuts him off dryly. "Their brains just haven't realized it yet. Cut the intercept. Save the batteries." A dry click of the toggle switch instantly cuts off the enemy hysteria. Inside the cramped hull, a heavy, oppressive silence hangs once more, broken only by the steady, menacing hum of the running diesel. The crew inhales the tainted air with heavy rasps. Cold, sticky sweat trickles down dirty necks, freezing instantly in the icy draft. Nervous tension doesn't let go for a second. Pulses throb heavily and rhythmically in their temples. Relaxing is strictly forbidden. Relaxation is synonymous with death. Suddenly, the freezing air above the pine tops compresses. A sharp, rising howl rips through the leaden, low sky. The sound plummets, turning into a piercing, ear-drilling whistle. German long-range artillery is firing blind, desperately trying to bracket the grid square where the shortwave radio was active a minute ago. The enemy has fixed the signal source. "Mortars! Driver, reverse! Full throttle, get us out of here!" The command sounds without a trace of fear. Kuznetsov's words merge with a deafening blast. A heavy 120mm mortar round lands with a terrifying roar just 15 meters from the camouflaged machine. The frozen earth erupts in a giant black fountain of soil and snow. Sharp, white-hot steel shrapnel shrieks as it lashes the sloped frontal armor, kicking up dense showers of bright sparks. Trees around them snap in half with a crack, showering the tank with heavy branches and clumps of frozen mud. The driver, acting instantly on reflexes hammered in by training, stomps the stiff clutch pedal and slams the steel lever into reverse. The transmission wails under the strain. The diesel engine abruptly belches a thick cloud of acrid black smoke. 30 tons of metal surge backward in a powerful, life-saving jolt, snapping the trunks of young undergrowth. The wide tracks grind the icy crust with a loud clatter. The next powerful blast lands exactly where the Soviet tank had stood a second ago. The deep, fresh crater immediately fills with thick TNT smoke. Death was exactly one heartbeat too late. The war machine quickly rolls back into the saving, dense shadow of the winter forest. No unnecessary words on the net. No signs of panic or animal fear. The faces of the 4 tankers remain absolute stone masks. The instinct for self-preservation works solely at the level of mechanical muscle memory and dry calculation. The risk of sudden death is perceived by them as a normal, inevitable, routine part of the technological process of war. The threat of being hit has passed. The engine slowly drops its high RPMs. The crew freezes in total silence, waiting tensely for new orders from HQ. War tolerates no stops. The heavy rumble of exploding mortar rounds slowly dissolves into the freezing air. Snow dust settles on the white-hot glacis plate, instantly turning into dirty steam. The respite lasts exactly 3 minutes. That's exactly how much time the surviving German artillery needs to adjust their aim. But the Soviet crew doesn't wait for the second volley. War never forgives long halts. Any static position on this frozen line inevitably turns into a steel mass grave. There will be no rest. Hypothermic bodies demand life-saving sleep, but frontline logistics dictate entirely different, harsh rules. Death takes no breaks for warming up by a fire. Morse code clicks dryly in the tank headsets again. The coded signal from the Tank Brigade HQ breaks through the dense atmospheric interference with great difficulty. Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov silently receives the incoming radiogram. No words of praise for the destroyed lead wedge, no promises of quick relief, warm shelter, or hot army rations. The airwaves bring only a short set of fresh topographic coordinates. This means only a new firing position, a new armored target, and more heavy soldiers' work. War demands continuous forward movement as long as hearts beat and drive sprockets turn. The tank commander snaps open his worn map case right on his ice-covered knees. The dim light of a narrow-beam pocket flashlight picks out a dense network of heights, hollows, and frozen rivers from the thick gloom of the turret. The frozen graphite of his pencil traces a straight vector through the dense stands of coniferous forest, with a quiet scratch. Driver, listen up. Grid 42, Hill 118. Moving out immediately. Fuel in the tanks is exactly enough for 30 kilometers of marching over heavy ground, the driver reports, with clinical dryness, staring at the dimly lit, shivering needle of the gauge. Distance to the new objective is 8 kilometers straight. A meeting engagement is guaranteed. The German vanguard is smashed, but the rest of the armada has begun a full-scale withdrawal. They're cornered. They'll snap back with every barrel they have. Understood. Confirming route to the hill. Commencing movement. No long tactical discussions. Supreme heroism here has finally and irrevocably dissolved into the grueling, dirty frontline routine. Survival in this frozen hell isn't a reward. It's just a temporary pass into the next brutal fight. The tank violently sheds the remnants of its winter camouflage netting. The frozen, stiff fabric had fused to the turret's icy armor. The tracks jerk powerfully. The steel teeth of the links
tear the hardened material into fine threads with a deafening screech. Camouflage is no longer needed. The open, merciless pursuit of the retreating enemy begins. The German war machine has suffered a deep strategic crack, and now a Soviet steel wedge must be driven into that rift, blow by blow, methodically. The wind outside the armored hull intensifies sharply. A dense, blinding ground blizzard begins. The air temperature continues to plummet, aggressively squeezing the last calories of heat from exhausted human bodies. Ahead lie many kilometers of frozen forest track, choked with abandoned enemy equipment and the stiffened corpses of soldiers. The Germans have finally turned into the walking dead. They weren't just broken by reliable Soviet armor. Their morale was completely destroyed by the absolute Siberian sub-zero.
But a wounded, cornered beast is extremely dangerous to its pursuer. Every inconspicuous fold in the terrain, every snow-covered mound hides a carefully camouflaged anti-tank gun or a team with anti-tank mines. The risk increases with every meter gained. The driver grips the icy knob of the gear lever with both hands. The cold metal painfully sears his palms even through thick wool mittens. The gearbox fiercely resists the effort. The thick transmission grease has frozen solid from the short, forced halt in the extreme cold. The driver takes a deep, ragged breath, gathering all his remaining physical strength, and with a powerful, furious lunge of his entire body, slams the steel lever into the proper slot. The transmission responds immediately with a dull, painful clang. Heavy gears mesh with a grinding screech. Torque is transferred to the drive wheels. The V2 diesel engine responds instantly, without delay, to the sharp press of the fuel pedal. The heavy, low roar of the powerful tank motor completely drowns out the dismal howl of the rising snowstorm. Long exhaust pipes forcefully belch thick, black clouds of blue-gray smoke directly into the white veil. The wide steel tracks rip out entire chunks of frozen soil with immense force. 30 tons of heavy alloy steel lunge forward, relentlessly picking up combat cruising speed. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, a tense, working silence hangs once more. With mechanical, practiced movements, the loader wipes the heavy brass casings of the armor-piercing shells with a piece of stiff, dirty rag. Any moisture on the metal is strictly forbidden. A shell will jam tight in a white-hot breach in sub-zero temperatures. The gunner doesn't take his inflamed red eyes off the eyepiece of the panoramic sight for a second, desperately trying to pierce the dense, white veil of the blizzard with his strained gaze. Kuznetsov braces himself firmly in the hard commander's seat. The muscles in his back and legs are locked in a constant, painful cramp from the piercing cold and chronic fatigue. The enemy is fleeing in panic. Vaunted European military discipline has finally collapsed under the insurmountable weight of frozen gun bolts, snapped tank tracks, and crystallized synthetic oil. But this objective statement of fact brings no joy. The crew must perform one more extremely difficult task: clearing their native land of armed, alien trash. The Soviet tank cuts confidently into the dense wall of falling, hard snow. Visibility plummets to a pathetic 20 meters. Orientation in space is now maintained solely by the tank's gyro compass and the driver's predatory instinct. The heavy steel machine quickly dissolves into the icy snow chaos, leaving behind only a deep forest track mangled by steel tracks. Ahead of them lie a new, nameless height, snow-covered enemy trenches, and the next inevitable visual contact through the crosshairs of the optical sight. Direct orders received, fuel fed to the injectors, engine running steady. Death methodically continues its non-stop frontline work on this frozen axis. The snowstorm finally buries the ambitions of European strategists. The illusion of lightning war has shattered against the frozen Russian soil. The Blitzkrieg didn't die in pretty staff reports. It croaked here, in deep Moscow snowdrifts, choking on frozen synthetic oil. The concept of rapid armored breakthroughs proved utterly powerless against absolute zero. The German army built its offensive doctrine on perfect asphalt roads and warm weather. When faced with harsh climatic reality, their flawless mechanism suffered a fatal, irreparable failure. Tens of thousands of tons of first-class metal are abandoned forever on icy roadsides. Elite motorized divisions have completely ceased to exist as combat units. Their vaunted Maybach gasoline engines turned out to be a death trap for their own crews. Perfectly fitted parts were frozen solid. High-octane fuel separated in the tanks. This isn't a temporary tactical retreat. This is a full-scale logistical, technical, and psychological catastrophe for a massive continental army. Inside the Soviet machine, there is no understanding of the historical grandeur of this moment. For Senior Sergeant Kuznetsov's crew, this day is just another grueling shift on the steel assembly line. No grandiosity of savior of the motherland rhetoric, only a ringing, painful emptiness in concussed heads and a throbbing ache in joints worn to the bone. They feel the great turning point in the war only as extreme muscular fatigue. Dirty quilted jackets, smelling of burnt powder and sweat, stand stiff in the icy draft. The Siberians silently do their exhausting, dirty work. They are simply methodically destroying those who came to kill on their land. It is a frozen, absolutely pragmatic professional calculation. All human emotions were burned out long ago by suffocating carbon monoxide. Instincts are honed solely for finding new targets in the crosshairs of the optical sight. The tankers' ragged breathing gradually evens out, their pulses slow to the rhythm of the working pistons. The Soviet V2 diesel motor hums monotonously and menacingly, cutting through the dense snow veil. The aluminum cylinder block confidently handles the critical drops in external temperatures. The reliability of this crude, unrefined steel became the primary, final verdict for the German high-tech machine. Where European gears snapped with a dry crack from the slightest overstrain, the wide Soviet tracks continued to relentlessly grind ice and human bone. The engineering of harsh survival unconditionally defeated the engineering of comfort. The brilliant simplicity of the design ensured absolute survivability in these unbearable conditions. The driver shifts the stiff gears purely mechanically, on reflexes alone, giving no thought to the global strategy of general staffs. He just knows for a fact that his machine won't stall on the next steep climb. This hollow iron trust in their tool makes them unstoppable. The tank crawls slowly, heavily, past an endless line of frozen occupiers. Anti-tank guns, covered in thick snow, stick up into the pale sky like mute iron crosses to foreign pride. The sharp north wind methodically buries the stiffened corpses under a smooth white layer, forever erasing any traces of the invincible armada's recent presence. The myth of total superiority has frozen forever into this hard Moscow ice. Their vaunted invincibility turned out to be nothing but a hollow piece of propaganda paper that couldn't withstand the harsh test of real frost and Russian metal. Kuznetsov's dry, inflamed gaze records the scale of destruction through the vision slit. Inside, there isn't a single drop of human pity. Visual contact with a dead, frozen enemy evokes only a dull irritation that there is still too much work ahead to clear the territory. The radio is deathly silent. The airwaves are absolutely empty. The blizzard intensifies rapidly with every passing minute. Hard, stinging granules lash the sloped glacis plate with such monstrous force that they strip the remnants of green protective paint down to the bare, gleaming metal. The narrow vision blocks are instantly choked with an impenetrable white mass. The driver steers the 30-ton behemoth almost blindly. He navigates solely by the dull vibration of the steel hull and the stiff resistance of the control levers. The road wheels crush abandoned German small arms with a loud crunch. The fragile wooden stocks of rifles shatter into tiny splinters under the ruthless weight of the metal. This sound of breaking wood and bending foreign iron merges into a single, monotonous, mechanical roar. The enemy's weapons quickly turn into useless, flattened scrap, pressed forever into the frozen soil of the track. The space around the living men shrinks to the size of a cramped fighting compartment, smelling of blood and burnt oil. The gunner stares blankly, without blinking, at the massive breech of the gun, which is covered in a thick layer of frost. His cramped arms hang like limp whips along his torso. The loader leans his thin shoulder heavily against the cold side of the turret, drawing in the freezing air with a loud rasp. Every ragged breath leaves a thick crust of ice on their unshaven faces. They are alive right now only because they continue their non-stop forward movement. Stopping in this extreme cold is certain, inevitable death for the entire crew. War grants them absolutely no right to respite or weakness. War harshly demands that they be living mechanisms, completely devoid of doubt and pain. And they merge completely with the armor. Human flesh has finally fused with the alloy steel. They have become a single, monolithic instrument of destruction, born in the snowy taiga. Darkness slowly but inexorably swallows the short, pale winter day. A thick, white haze tightly conceals the horizon line. The dark green, angular silhouette of the Soviet tank gradually dissolves into the raging snowstorm. The sharp edges of the armored hull visually merge with the falling snow. All that remains is the low, vibrating sound of the heavy diesel running at its limit. This monotonous roar is the last thing the German infantrymen, freezing in deep snowdrifts, hear before slipping forever into a black, icy coma. The dull clatter of the tracks recedes further and further west, toward where new, nameless heights, new deadly ambushes, and new, long echelons of foreign steel await the crew. This metal must be methodically turned into dead scrap without unnecessary emotion. The great battle for survival continues, without slowing its merciless pace for a second. The will of the Siberians proved stronger than Krupp steel. Ahead, only a ringing emptiness remained, and the heavy, rhythmic clatter of tank tracks receding into the darkness.